Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at empiricism, the epistemological idea that ultimately all knowledge comes from experience. And in this video we are going to be concentrating mainly on John Locke's version of empiricism. Before we do that, however, I just want to bring to your attention things that you need to know to evaluate both empiricist and rationalist arguments. So you need to know what ability knowledge is, you need to know what propositional knowledge is. You need to know the definition of rationalism in the same way that I've just given you the definition of empiricism. You need to know what a priori knowledge is, and you need to know what a posteriori knowledge is, and also the difference between induction and deduction. Now, I've got videos on all of this stuff, so if you're not sure about any of these things, do please watch that particular video. But let's now crack on with empiricism. So John Locke is generally thought of as the first high-profile empiricist in early modern philosophy anyway. Arguably Aristotle was a sort of fundamental ancient Greek empiricist, but for the purposes of the AQA specification, John Locke is the first high-profile empiricist. And as I said at the start, empiricists believe that at a fundamental level, all our knowledge is derived from experience, making it a posteriori knowledge, right? Knowledge after experience, as opposed to a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that is known independently of experience. Now, empiricism relates closely to the theories of perception that you will have studied. So, direct realism, for example, is an empiricist theory of perception. It believes that, or it argues that our perceptions show us the world exactly as it is, and from that we can gain knowledge. Indirect realism also believes in a mind-independent reality, but also thinks that the mind or the senses mediate that and represent that mind-independent reality to us through the veil of perception. And idealism is a strange empiricist theory in the sense that George Berkeley believed that everything was just a collection of ideas in the mind, but ultimately knowledge still came from experience because you had to experience things in order to have ideas, and the experiences themselves he thought of to be ideas in a way. Okay, so it's important that you can relate empiricism to the theories of perception. So, as I said, empiricists believe that ultimately all knowledge comes from experience, making knowledge a posteriori. Okay, knowledge after experience. However, it is important to note that empiricists do not believe there's no such thing as a priori knowledge, but they only believe that a priori knowledge exists in a trivial sense. All right. They believe, for example, that it is possible to know that a triangle has three sides independently of experience and know it to be true just from analysis of the terms involved, although those terms themselves, those ideas, ultimately are rooted in experience, and the reasons for that should become clear shortly. All right. But at this stage, yeah, the idea of a triangle still ultimately had to come from experience. Once we've got that idea in our minds, then we can know that a triangle has three sides is true by definition, is analytically true, in the same way that we can know that a triangle has four sides is analytically false. All right. So just to summarize this again, empiricists believe that ultimately all knowledge comes from experience, but that one can have a priori knowledge in a sort of trivial way, in a trivial sense, once we've already got the ideas in our minds that we had originally derived from experience. Now, John Locke opposed the idea that we are born with any innate knowledge, any innate ideas. So he rejects rationalism, which is the school of thought in philosophy that believes that knowledge comes from innate ideas and from reason, so that knowledge is ultimately a priori. Okay, it's essentially the opposite of empiricism. And Locke said that if we did have innate ideas, then obviously they would be in us from birth. And if they are in us from birth, then it follows that we know things from birth, right? Anyone with a mind would know what these innate ideas. But babies are apparently completely ignorant. Right, so Locke actually believes that the mind is a blank slate at birth, a tabula rasa, right, a blank slate. Okay, but what does Locke mean actually by ideas? Well, an idea can be either a concept such as red table sky, or a thought such as I think I'll go and water the garden. All right, and Locke's definition of an innate idea is one that is not gained through experience. And as I say, he didn't believe there were such things as innate ideas, right? Because he says, look, it's quite clear when you have a small child, they just don't know anything, right? Now, rationalists have argued that there are certain mathematical or geometrical truths that can be known independently of experience. You'll recall perhaps Plato's slave boy example in the Meno, when Socrates asks a slave boy with no education he gives him a geometrical problem, and the slave boy, just through answering questions, is able to come to the correct answer. And Socrates claims that this is demonstrating that the boy did actually have some sort of innate idea of mathematics in the first place. Now, there are all sorts of objections to that, not least that the questions are leading, and Locke thinks that there are these things do not exist. All right, there are no innate ideas. Now, he does believe, however, that we remember our experiences through repetition. So when you're born, you will encounter various things such as colour. When your eyes open and your brain encounters particular light wavelengths. From these memories, we gradually form concepts. All right. First, the ideas of red and yellow. When we open our eyes, when we're a few days old, we begin to experience the world around us, and the mind is unconsciously kind of storing away these experiences and categorizing them. All right, colours, for example, to begin with, and it recognises that it's had a particular experience before and gradually forms an idea. All right, so firstly we get ideas, for example, of red and yellow, and then once we've got a whole group of experiences that are similar, such as red, yellow, blue, purple, green, and so on, we then form a kind of abstract concept of colour that we then use as a sort of umbrella term. All right. So Locke argues that whilst the sensation or the experience of seeing the colour yellow is not itself the concept of yellow, the experience is what leads to the idea, the development of the idea of yellow. All right. So we start with experiences of the physical world in our own mind and gradually impose our ideas or a conceptual order on our experiences. Now, going back to this argument against rationalism, or against the idea, for example, that we have innate ideas, a child needs to be able to count before they can understand that 2 + 3 = 5. And they need to understand what a square is before they can understand the analytic proposition a triangle has 3 sides. They need to learn language before they can put ideas together. All right, we learn language through experience, Locke thinks. We are taught it. Okay, so again, this is not something that is innate in us. So, according to empiricists, ideas come about through repeated experience, and the consistency of our experiences is what allows the brain to form ideas. All right. So, it's a good opportunity at this point to make a link between Locke's empiricism and his thoughts on representative or indirect realism. All right, so as you know, the theory of indirect realism is a theory of perception that argues that there is a mind-independent world about which we can gain knowledge through the senses. All right. Now, Locke is an indirect realist and an empiricist. All right, those two go together. All right. He believes that our senses represent the mind-independent world to us, and from that we can come to have knowledge of it. And he thinks that both primary and secondary qualities give us ideas about the external world. Now, I won't say too much about primary and secondary qualities here, as I deal with that in the video on indirect realism. But both primary and secondary qualities, so primary qualities such as size, or a secondary quality such as blue, the colour, they are simple ideas upon which more complex ideas come about. So I think I will go and water the garden plants is made up of of simple ideas that we gradually put together. So we have the concept of think, we have the concept of water, we have the concept of plant, right? Whether or not these are actually simple ideas is open to question, but obviously once you've got those ideas, you can then combine them in ways that produce more complex ideas. So this is the move from simple ideas to complex ideas that Locke makes. Okay, so more complex ideas can be built out of simple ones, and that's how we can build up a knowledge base. Right? And this differs very much from Descartes' method of establishing knowledge, which he believes can be done entirely through reason and deducing things from certain innate ideas that we have. And I've got a separate video on Descartes should you want to familiarise yourself with that. So, simple ideas are planted in the mind as a result of the effect that primary qualities have on the senses, and those primary qualities themselves, such as size and shape, the physical object itself then affects the senses in a particular way to produce secondary qualities, and from that combination of experiences we develop ideas about the world. Okay. Secondary qualities, it's important to realise, are also simple ideas, but, and this relates again to indirect realism, secondary qualities are the way in which the mind represents the physical world to us. So, put another way, it's the way that the physical world affects the senses and produces particular kinds of sensation in us, such as colour and sound, for example. All right? But the experiences that we have as a result of that are what allow us to produce simple ideas. And from those simple ideas, we construct more complex ideas. All right? So the concept of a cat is created out of many simple ideas that we have put together. And whenever we encounter such simple ideas in a particular combination, we remember cat and have thus created a more complex idea. Now, this then leads us to abstraction and combination. All right, so when we think about a concept in the abstract, such as a cat, we do not have a particular example of a cat in mind. We've just got this idea of a cat. All right. Now, how is this possible if we need to develop complex ideas from those that correspond with particular objects? Now, Locke argues that we can form concepts through abstraction. In other words, we take those qualities that are common to all cats and not, say, common to all dogs in our formation of concepts, right? And then our mind has a series of ideas that are both necessary and sufficient for us to then develop the idea of a cat, whereas they are not necessarily necessary or sufficient to form an idea of a dog. All right? It seems kind of complicated, that, but that's the basic idea behind it. And so through this process, we're able to create more and more sophisticated ideas about the world and come to an understanding of its nature. And of course, we're also able to develop fictitious ideas, such as hippogriffs, which is a kind of bird horse, right? Or unicorns and things like that. We've got ideas already. We're able to manipulate them into fictitious complex ideas. Right? Such is the complexity of the human mind. Now, we can object to this idea of concept acquisition. How do you know, for example, that when you're recalling ideas, when you're in the abstract, that you're recalling the correct ideas? You've only got your own memory to refer to after all. So how can you be sure that you have remembered particular experiences that have gone to create those ideas correctly? That's the first thing. More importantly, how do you know that you have appealed to the correct idea in your head when engaging in the looking up process? So, you're trying to look up the correct idea for something, all right, say a colour. How do you know that you've got that right? So looking up red in your mind, this is the idea of sort of concept acquisition that Locke is appealing to, this idea that our mind stores away repeated experiences under one concept and let's say calls it red. How do we know that we're looking up the right concept? Right? So looking up red presupposes the nature of what I need to find. So then that suggests that the idea of red is already there, which might lend you to think of arguments for innate knowledge rather than suggesting that it's all come from experience. And given that many of our ideas come from secondary qualities, and given that we do not know whether secondary qualities are accurate representations of the external world, how do we know that the ideas that come from them are accurate ways of describing the world? Now, this is a form of skepticism. All right? Locke, in his indirect realism, has already said that secondary qualities are just the mind's representation of reality, right? They are how our mind and our senses are able to represent the mind-independent world to us. But if that representation is limited, or if that representation shows us something that is not exactly what's there, then obviously we will have developed ideas from those experiences. So then the question is, how do we know whether the ideas that we've got are the correct ideas for describing reality? And that's perhaps the most serious objection in this whole set here. Now, just before we finish, I do want to just talk a little bit, about induction and deduction, and I have done this elsewhere, but I'm going to do it again very quickly, because it's certainly the case that induction is essentially the way in which most science works, and most science works in a way that rests on experience. Right? So scientists are, by and large, empiricists, barring a few theoretical mathematicians. All right? And they rely on the process of induction. And from what they derive from induction, they are then able to deduce certain further truths. And this is just basically what we're going to look at here. So an inductive argument draws an inference which does not logically follow from the premises, but is supported by the premises. For example, all species of fish I have observed only have one head. So I then, because I've said, well, I've done a lot of observation of fish, they've all only got one head, therefore I'm justified in assuming that every fish only has one head. Now, I'm sure you can see the problem. It would only take one example of a fish with two heads or more to scupper my belief that all fish only have one head. All right, but that is known as the problem of induction. All right, because on the one hand, induction is the way that we get most of our knowledge, but it does suffer from this difficulty. That's it only takes one counterexample to scupper the whole thing. And a very famous example of this was the belief back in the day that all swans were white, because the only swans that had ever been observed in England were white swans. And then it turned out, of course, that there were black swans in Australia. And so the belief that all swans were white, based on that finite series of observations that existed before people went to Australia, that showed that this problem of induction is actually something very real. Okay. Now, an inductive argument basically allows for the conclusion to sort of probably be true. There's a high degree of likelihood, for example, that all mammals have hearts, right? It's very unlikely that you're going to find a living mammal without a heart, right? All the mammals that have ever been observed have got hearts, right? Nevertheless, it doesn't guarantee that all mammals have hearts. One day, perhaps, there will be a mammal without a heart, or perhaps there's one that already exists that we haven't discovered, okay? But it's very unlikely. But it's not infallible. Induction is not infallible, and that's the problem. Okay. Now, we can contrast induction with deduction. And a deductive argument is one in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. For example, premise 1, every mammal has a heart. Premise 2, all horses are mammals. Conclusion, that should say C rather than P3, I apologise. Every horse has a heart. So, premise 1, every mammal has a heart. Premise 2, all horses are mammals. Conclusion, it must therefore be the case that every horse has a heart. The interesting part of this is that if the premises are true in a deductive argument, then the conclusion must necessarily follow. The conclusion is guaranteed. It is infallible, right? But it does rely on both of the premises being true if the conclusion is going to be true. Now, of course, the two premises are inductive, all right? So you've got this rather kind of inconvenient setup where induction is the method by which we attain most of our knowledge through science, but it suffers from the problem of induction, so it's fallible, right? And deduction is a method of argument where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, so the conclusion is guaranteed to be true if both the premises are true. The problem is that the premises are based on induction, right? Every mammal has a heart is something that we have come to believe through induction, all right? And so although the argument is logically valid in this case, that the conclusion must necessarily follow from the two premises, because the first premise is at least in principle fallible, it means therefore the conclusion is also in principle fallible. All right, so whilst deduction on its own terms is an infallible form of argument, it relies on induction for its premises, right? And so it can never itself guarantee truth either. Right, that's the end of this video, and in the next video we are going to look more at empiricism and David Hume's relations of ideas and matters of fact, so Hume's fork.